typically don't remember a year by what happened. I remember it by the books that carried me through it. Hi, and welcome back to Offbeat Journeys. I'm James, an independent author, and in this series, I sit down with other indie authors and ask them three deceptively simple questions. The childhood book that changed everything, the book that broke their heart, and the book that flipped everything they thought they knew. Then we dive deeper into their work, their process, and the stories they're building next. But sometimes, like today, it'll just be me. Last episode, I told you about the books I still carry with me, the one that still haunts me, the other book that rewired my brain, and the book that made me feel seen. In this episode, that is coming to you a little later than I hoped, we're going to take a moment to reflect, because today, I want to tell you about the books that carried me through the uncertainty and chaos of the last 12 months. When I look back on a year, I don't usually remember it by dates or milestones. I remember the stories that kept me company throughout it. The books I read in the last 12 months weren't chosen with any grand plan in mind. They were simply sitting on my TBR list. But looking at them now, side by side, I can kind of see a pattern. Not in genre, but in need. So today, I want to talk to you about 5 books that shaped my year. Not necessarily the best books I read, but the ones that stayed with me and quietly say something about where my head was at the time. But before we dive in, can I ask you a tiny favor? If you enjoyed this episode, would you share it with just one friend? Word of mouth is genuinely the lifeblood of indie creators, and even one new person makes a huge difference. Thank you. Let's begin. Book 1, The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Regret, choice, interior life. This book had been on my TBR pile for a while. I'd also received some really strong recommendations before starting it, and it didn't disappoint. The alternate realities are a clever device, but they're really just a framework for something deeper, finding meaning in the life you're already living, embracing your decisions and mistakes, letting go of regret, accepting yourself. This book met me at a very specific emotional moment. What stayed with me wasn't the central concept. Most people following me already know it well, but the exhaustion underneath it. That sense of wondering whether another version of your life might have been easier, quieter, more fulfilling. It made me think about how much mental energy we spend replaying choices, instead of living fully inside the ones we've already made. Reading The Midnight Library this year felt less like reading fantasy and more like looking into a mirror. Not a comfortable read, but an honest one. Book 2, The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. Endurance and quiet courage. This book did something very different. It wasn't originally on my list. Someone loaned it to me and told me I had to read it, and I'm very glad I did. It's quietly powerful throughout. The resistance, the persistence, the reminder that no matter how bad the circumstances, sometimes the only way forward is to dust yourself down and keep going long enough to win. And then, those final heartbreaking chapters. I won't spoil anything, but if you haven't read it yet, do yourself a massive favour and pick it up. You won't regret it. Where the Midnight Library turned inward, The Nightingale forced my attention outward, towards sacrifice, courage, and the cost of doing what's right when no one is watching. What struck me wasn't cinematic heroism, it was persistence. The kind that doesn't just announce itself, the kind that just keeps going. Reading it this year reminded me that strength rarely looks how we expect it to, and that some of the bravest people in history were ordinary people refusing to abandon their values. Book 3, Beyond the Wand by Tom Felton. Identity under expectation. This one surprised me, both in what I expected to learn and in what I actually learned. I picked it up as someone who grew up loving the Harry Potter books and films. It felt like growing up alongside the actors who played those roles. I expected nostalgia, behind-the-scenes stories, What I didn't expect was how clearly it explored what happens when the world decides who you are before you do. What stayed with me was the tension between the public story and the private one, between being recognised everywhere and feeling uncertain inside. It made me more sympathetic to people whose confidence looks effortless from the outside, and more aware of how heavy expectations can be made when they arrive too early, too loudly, or permanently. Book 4, The 7 Moons of Mali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka. Systems, Aftermath, Moral Complexity. This was the most challenging book I read in the last 12 months, and possibly the most important. I'll admit, there were moments when I felt lost reading it. This isn't a book that holds your hand, but if you stay with it until the end, it's worth it. What stayed with me wasn't just the story, but the way it dealt with consequences. Who gets remembered? Who gets erased? And how violence doesn't just end because the noise stops. It lingers in systems, in silence, in what's left unsaid. This book sharpened my awareness of how power operates quietly and how truth often arrives late, if it arrives at all. It didn't offer comfort, but it did offer clarity. Book 5, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Redemption and moral simplicity. Ending my year with this one felt right. I'd never actually read it before, so I thought, why not now? And not just because it was seasonal, but because it's timeless. What struck me was how uncomplicated its moral centre is, that change is possible, that kindness matters, that people are not fixed. In a year filled with complexity and difficult truths, this story reminded me that empathy has always been radical and necessary. And when you look at these 5 books together, a complete arc starts to form. Regret, endurance, identity, systems, and change. These books were not chosen deliberately, but together they map the emotional terrain of my year. And that's what reading does at its best. It doesn't just entertain us, it keeps track of who we're becoming. When I look at the stories I'm carrying into the next 12 months, especially Unkindness and the as yet unnamed Cocoon Memoirs project, I can see these influences clearly, not in plot, but in values. Empathy, attention, the cost of systems, and the possibility of change. Those are threads I want to keep pulling, and I can't wait to share both of these stories in the next 12 months. Unkindness, the story I'm continuing. The Cocoon Memoirs, the story I'm reviving. If you're listening to this and thinking about the books that quietly shaped your year, the shortlist you didn't mean to make, you're not alone. Sometimes the stories we read say more about us than we realise. That's it for another episode of Offbeat Journeys. If you want to follow along, hit subscribe wherever you're listening. And if something today resonated, you can also find me on my free weekly Substack newsletter, Offbeat Journeys by James. The link is in the show notes. And if you enjoyed today's episode, one last small favour. Leaving an honest rating and review really helps other book lovers find the show. It only takes a few seconds, but it makes a world of difference for indie podcasts like this one. For now, I'm James. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you on the next mile of the Offbeat Journey.